In 2024, the federal government sent a diesel mechanic to prison. His crime wasn't theft, it wasn't fraud. He flashed software onto pickup trucks that switched off their emissions equipment, the same thing thousands of shops across America were quietly doing every single day. The government picked him, made an example of him, and locked the door. 18 months later, in the winter of 2026, that same government did something almost nobody saw coming. It walked into the press and announced it was done. No more prison. No more criminal cases. Drop the ones already filed. After 10 years, hundreds of prosecutions, and tens of millions of dollars in fines, Washington's war on the old diesel ended not with a verdict, but with a white flag. This is the story of how the most powerful environmental agency on Earth spent a decade trying to kill a kind of engine and then surrendered. It's a story with real villains and real victims, except the catch is that, depending on where you stand, they're the same people. Because the trucks at the center of this war did pump real poison into the air, and the men who built and bought them did get treated like criminals for it. So who actually won? And here's the part the celebration headlines left out if you own one of these trucks. The surrender you're cheering may not protect you at all. The white flag has fine print. Let's read it. Chapter 1, The Corner. To understand the surrender, you have to understand why the war started. And it started with the biggest corporate cheat in automotive history. In September of 2015, the EPA caught Volkswagen red-handed. The company had buried secret software in 11 million diesel cars worldwide, software that could sense when it was being tested, clean up its act for the lab, then switch the emissions controls back off on the open road, where the cars pumped out up to 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxides. It cost Volkswagen tens of billions of dollars and put executives in prison. And it taught the EPA 2 words it would never forget. Defeat device. Because here's what the agency realized. Volkswagen built defeat devices in a factory, but out in the real world, in strip mall diesel shops from Texas to Pennsylvania, Americans were building their own. And they weren't hiding it, they were proud of it. The culture was called deleting. You take a modern diesel truck, a Power Stroke, a Cummins, a Duramax strangled by its own emissions hardware. The particulate filter, the exhaust fluid system, the recirculation valve. You rip it all out. You flash the computer to forget it was ever there. And suddenly the truck makes more power, gets better mileage, never drops into limp mode, and rolls coal at will. A whole industry grew up around it. Tuners, delete kits, software sold openly, installed in an afternoon. And the EPA was watching the cost add up. Its own air enforcement division ran the numbers and found something that's hard to wave away. Defeat devices sold for diesel pickups in a single decade had put more than 570,000 tons of excess nitrogen oxides into American air. Roughly 550,000 trucks, about 15% of the country's diesel pickups, had been stripped. The agency said the air quality damage was the equivalent of adding 9 million extra trucks to the road. Now you can argue about that number. Diesel people do. But you can't pretend it's nothing. NOx isn't a culture war abstraction. It's the stuff that becomes smog and settles into the lungs of the people who live next to the highway. The trucks were real. The pollution was real. And in June of 2019, the EPA made it official. Stopping aftermarket defeat devices became a national compliance initiative, bureaucratic language, for this is now one of the most serious things we hunt. The war was declared, and the agency went hunting. Chapter 2, the campaign. The first weapon was money, and it was aimed at the supply chain. The EPA didn't have to chase every truck owner one at a time. It went after the shops and the companies that made the parts. And the math was brutal by design. The Clean Air Act let the agency seek civil penalties of up to $45,000 per vehicle, and several thousand more for every defeat device sold. Multiply that by a company that moved thousands of tuners, and you bankrupt it overnight. And they did. A tuning company called Punch It Performance paid $850,000 and was forced to hand over its own software code. A company called Performance Diesel paid $1.1 million for selling around 5,500 defeat devices. These weren't one-offs. Between 2017 and the early 2020s, the EPA resolved more than 170 of these civil cases and pulled in over $55 million in penalties. The year 2020 set a record, the most tampering cases the agency had ever closed in its history. That was the Civil War. Then it turned criminal. Selling a part is one thing, going to prison is another, and starting in the early 2020s, the Justice Department stopped treating diesel tuning as a business violation and started treating it as a federal crime. In 2022, the owner of a well-known Louisiana tuning company pleaded guilty to manufacturing defeat devices. In 2024, he was sentenced. By that point, the government had stacked up at least 17 criminal cases, more than $5 million in criminal fines, and a combined 54 months of prison time handed to men whose entire business was making trucks run. One of them was a tuner out west named Troy Lake. He disabled the diagnostic systems on hundreds of trucks, and he went to federal prison for it. Remember that name. He comes back at the end of this story, and while the lawyers fought, the engineers were building the weapon meant to end the war for good. Regulation, a new wave of federal standards, scheduled to land in 2027, would squeeze heavy-duty diesels harder than ever. More sensors, more exhaust fluid hardware, more of the exact fragility owners hated. It was a slow kill, and it was clever. You don't have to ban the simple, rugged mechanical diesel. You just write rules that make every new one more complicated, more expensive, and more dependent on the very systems people were ripping out. Give it enough years, and the old way of building a diesel simply becomes illegal to sell. By 2024, the trajectory looked locked. Fines, prison, and a regulatory noose tightening on a schedule. The old diesel was on death row. And then the ground moved. Chapter 3: The Surrender. In November of 2025, the president pardoned a diesel mechanic. It was Troy Lake, the tuner, who'd gone to prison. He walked out, his record wiped, and the message to the entire diesel world was unmistakable. The wind had changed. Then came the formal retreat. On January 21st, 2026, the Department of Justice, the same department that had been sending these men to prison, issued a memo. From now on, it would no longer pursue criminal charges for diesel emissions tampering. Drop the pending cases. Stop filing new ones. The Deputy Attorney General framed it as the end of over-criminalizing ordinary people. 3 weeks later, the EPA went further. On February 12, 2026, it rescinded the legal foundation that 15 years of federal vehicle emissions rules had been built on a 2009 finding that greenhouse gases endangered public health. Strike that, and the standards stacked on top of it start to crumble, including the ones scheduled for 2027. The agency called it the single largest deregulatory action in American history. The diesel world erupted. After a decade of fines and prison and tightening rules, it looked like total victory. The war was over. The old diesel had won. Except read the fine print. Because a surrender and a ceasefire are not the same thing, and what happened in 2026 was a ceasefire. Here's what didn't change. The Clean Air Act is still law. Deleting a diesel is still illegal. The Justice Department stopped filing criminal charges, but the EPA can still come after you with civil penalties up to $45,268 per truck. That power was never touched. And the federal government was never the only army in this war. California, through its own air board, writes and enforces its own rules, and California surrendered nothing. Neither did the dozen-odd states that follow its lead. If you live in one of them, the white flag in Washington means exactly nothing in your driveway. There's more. A criminal enforcement policy is just a memo. It lasts exactly as long as the administration that wrote it. A different president, a different attorney general, and those prosecutions switch back on, and because the clock on these violations runs for years, the things you do today could still be reached tomorrow. There's a bill in Congress, the Diesel Truck Liberation Act, that would try to make the ceasefire permanent. As of right now, it's sitting in committee, where bills like it usually go to die. So who won? The tuner who got pardoned, yes? He's free. The shops that outlasted the fines can breathe again. But the truck owner cheering the headlines is standing on thinner ice than he knows. The criminal threat pulled back. The civil traps are all still armed, the states are still hunting, and the whole thing rests on a memo that the next election could tear up. So that's the real story of the decade-long war on the diesel. The government wasn't entirely wrong. Those trucks did foul the air, and that's not a number you get to wish away. And the government wasn't entirely right, either, because somewhere in the middle of enforcing it, they started sending mechanics to prison for making trucks run, and a country built on the right to fix your own machine decided it didn't much like the taste of that. In 2026, Washington blinked. Not because it admitted the engines were innocent, but because the politics of jailing diesel mechanics finally cost more than it was worth. That's not justice arriving, that's the wind changing. And the wind can change back. But here's the quiet thing underneath all of it. If you've got an old mechanical diesel, the kind from before any of this, no computer, nothing to delete, nothing to defeat you, sat the entire war out. They were never coming for the engine that didn't have the parts to remove. That's worth a long thought. The next time someone tells you newer is always better. If you ran a shop through these years, or you're driving a truck with the fine print hanging over it, tell me where you stand in the comments. I read them, and if you want to meet the engine the government couldn't touch because it was built before they had the power to the mechanical diesel that's been quietly outliving every regulation for 40 years, that's the next file.